Started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making it. So I'm very happy to have this very first talk of our Africa seminar series, which we are kicking off today. Well, 6 weeks down the line from the beginning of the semester, but better late than never. And we hope to be able to have exciting intellectual engagement throughout the year with students, faculty members, staff, and hopefully we'll be able to have these kind of events regularly throughout the year. So for this first installment of our seminar series, we'll have a focus on Africa for this first semester, and we have 5 of, I think, exciting talks which will start today. And today we have a very timely talk about Sudan and the recent events and the recent developments of what has happened. Ahmed Kadouda, who is from there and who has been visiting the country throughout those events, will be able to share his take on what is happening there. Then next week we'll have Chris Leuwald, who is going to talk about the macroeconomic policy in South Africa, which is one of the major emerging countries and the main economic power in Africa. Following that, we will have Elizabeth Carlson talking about issues of traditional leadership in Africa, which we have different types of institutions, modern type of institutions, but also more traditional institutions that work in conjunction with the modern institutions. So she will talk about how the institutions of chieftainship in Malawi work and what are the issues that are underlying those. So next we'll have Soji Adelaja, who is a prominent professor in land policy, and he will have a discussion about conflict and food systems on the continent. And finally, we'll have a discussion about migrant workers from Sierra Leone who are working in U.S. bases in Iraq. So that is a nice kind of a blend of national security issues, but also issues of those migrants and safety, etc. So I think this is a very nice blend, and I hope this lineup will bring meaningful discussion and intellectual exchange between all the members of our community. So I'd like to thank and acknowledge the sponsorship and collaboration of the College of Agricultural Science and the Center for Security and Security Research and Education.
Center for Security Research and Education.
Center for Security Research and Education for sponsoring many of these events, and we work hard with them to bring guests to have discussions which hopefully will be of interest to the community. So thank you very much. I would like now to call Brian to just introduce Ahmed, and then we'll start. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I'm Brian Thede. I'm a faculty member in rural sociology over in the College of Ag. And I'm happy to introduce Ahmed Kadouda, who's a Sudanese researcher and doctoral student in political science at George Washington University. He's an expert in the politics of the Horn of Africa and has considerable experience working and conducting research in the region. He's held positions with a number of large international NGOs in DC as well as Nairobi and Kampala, including the Aspen Institute, Freedom House, and most recently Safer World, where he worked with civil society groups in the region to promote peace building and conflict resolution. And he's currently drawing on that experience to conduct his doctoral research on ethnic politics, civil war, and democratization in sub-Saharan Africa. And this year he was awarded fellowships from the National Science Foundation and American Political Science Association to support this research. As his talk, the title of his talk suggests, Ahmed has particular experience and expertise in the politics of Sudan. He spent time in Khartoum during the recent uprising and political transition and retains close relationships with many of the leaders of the Sudan Professionals Association and members of the new transitional government. He's also emerged as kind of a leading expert on this topic and has been in high demand, appearing frequently in the media and more recently giving talks across DC, including at GW, Georgetown, and for the Congressional Black Caucus. So we're really happy to have him here today on campus to talk about the recent Sudan uprising and prospects for a transitional government. And all right, I'll pull this up for you there, Ahmed. Welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I'd like to start by, first of all, thanking Professor Hawk, Professor Sal, and the Center for Security Research and Education and the Department of Agricultural Sciences for inviting me to speak. So I am Sudanese. I was born and raised in Sudan. I lived there for a good chunk of my childhood. Then my family emigrated here to the U.S. But I've spent almost 3 months of every year since I've left in Sudan. So I've kept close connections with back home. And the uprising that's taken place and the current transition is something that I've personally followed and anticipated and hoped for and tried to work towards for a long time. I know we have, relatively cozy group, so I will be talking, but I hope you guys can stop me and ask any questions as I go along. And then I'll briefly have a Q&A at the end. All right. So as an overview, I'm going to talk about a few things. First, I'm going to give a historical overview of Sudan, how we got here. I'm going to talk about Bashir's tenure and the road to the uprising. Then I'll talk about the uprising itself and then the prospects for transition. So as a quick overview, Sudan, of course, got its independence from the United Kingdom in 1956. And it got its independence as a very weak post-colonial multi-ethnic state. And it really represents almost a poster child for post-colonial African states. It has a multi-ethnic population. It had very weak state institutions that were created to serve colonial interests. So like many sub-Saharan African states, it has a very small and closed metropole where resources were gathered from the peripheries for export. All the post-colonial governments kept that same framework and governed the country from the center at the expense of the periphery. This, of course, resulted in various civil wars from the dawn of independence in the south, which is this blue area, of course, and more recently in the 2000s in Darfur. Of course, most of you are familiar with the genocide that took place there. And then most recently in these two new, or vestiges, if you will, of the Southern War, South Kordofan and Blue Nile. These were very brutal ethnic wars in which the center that monopolized resources and power prevented equitable distribution of those resources. And as a result, you had a secessionist conflict in the south, which of course resulted in the independence of South Sudan in 2011. After a very brutal conflict that spanned almost 40 years, the South decided in a referendum to go its own way. Now, as a result, Sudan lost 70% of its oil revenues. The vast majority of the oil in the country that was being exported was coming from the south. The pipelines have to go through the north. So you had this infrastructure, but no resource. Now, interestingly, Sudan also mirrors other sub-Saharan post-colonial African states in the type of regimes that it's had. Since independence, we've had 3 very short, brief eras of parliamentary democracy, in between increasingly larger military autocracies. The first one in the 50s and 60s was about 6 years. The next one was 16 years. The third one lasted 30 years. So they almost doubled every time. Hopefully the next one doesn't last 60 years. And of course, the most recent autocrat was Omar al-Bashir. The first 2 autocracies like this one were also toppled by popular, peaceful uprisings driven by urban elites and professionals in order to basically galvanize, put pressure on the autocrat to step down. And that's what happened in 1964, 1985. This is a picture of students that, and I believe university professors, that were scheduled to go out in the 1964 revolution and the 1985 revolution. Each sector of the economy was given a day in which all the professionals would go out. So on one day, it would be the doctors, followed by the teachers, followed by the farmers, followed by the engineers. And it was very organized. This was because Sudan had a very strong history of labor mobilization. This was something Sudan inherited from the British. The period of colonization was, I think, one thing that Sudan got out of it, which was this very strong civil service. And the civil service was organized. So these 2 uprisings were basically the roots from which this uprising came out. Now, I'm going to give a brief overview of where Sudan is today. So it has 43 million people, but the 9th fastest growing population in the world. It's multi-ethnic. Despite the independence of South Sudan, it remains to be multi-ethnic. In North Sudan, or what is today Sudan, there are 70 indigenous languages, 500 ethnic groups, and now the population is 95% Muslim. The majority of the southern Sudanese were from traditional animist or Christian faiths. The economy. It's probably, a very, I can't paint a worse picture for you, but it was very bad. You had the 174th GDP per capita, a negative growth rate, which was 182nd in the world, 20% unemployment, and of course the resource curse. Because once Sudan started exporting oil, it neglected the vast majority of other industries, particularly agriculture. And again, this is one of the main themes that we see in some of these poor, weak, sub-Saharan African states. And of course, a very unstable country. It's 8th on the Fragile State Index, the various ongoing civil wars, and it has the 7th largest internally displaced population in the world. It also hosts almost 800,000 refugees, some from Eritrea, some from South Sudan, and it's also a transit country for refugees from the Horn of Africa. A lot of migrants and refugees have to go through Sudan onwards to Libya to cross the Mediterranean. So how did we get to the uprising? Of course, in 1989, after a very short-lived democratic period, the Islamist Party of Sudan, or the Sudanese Islamist movement, which was the shadow or the sister organization to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, decided to coup out the parliamentary system. In fact, the Islamist movement was part of the government. They were part of the elected parliament. But they decided to coup out their partners and basically take over the country. Bashir, when he came to power, he was more of a figurehead. The real power behind the throne was a man by the name of Hassan al-Turabi, who really ran the show. But over the 3 decades, Bashir increasingly consolidated his grip on power. First, he started to sideline the military and then empowered a very large political party that, through which he doled out patronage. Of course, there is a quintessential picture that I can draw for you about neo-patrimonialism, where resources are not distributed through institutions, but through personal relationships between the autocrat and those that he favors. In many of these places, we see the increasing size of state units. So Sudan, at independence, was about 8 units, and by the time South Sudan was about to secede, it was about 26 states with more units. And in each unit, you had a governor, a minister of health, a minister of education, a minister of culture. So it was a very top-heavy state. In order to dole out patronage, that's the easiest way an autocrat can do so. At the same time, in order to consolidate his grip on power, Bashir needed to spend a lot on security. In fact, by 2017, Sudan had the 3rd largest weapons industry in Africa. It was the 3rd largest exporter of weapons. This very poor state spent a lot of money in building and manufacturing weapons. And of course, since South Sudan seceded in 2011, Sudan lost all this oil, the patronage was so top-heavy that it couldn't be sustained. As a result, the autocrat decided to print money in order to keep paying for the patronage. This obviously resulted in inflation and a pretty bad economic crisis. Since the South seceded, we saw 2 major waves of protests. The first wave came during the Arab Spring, but quickly fizzled out for many reasons. Most importantly, that the political opposition wasn't able to coordinate amongst itself. Bashir was very instrumental in dividing the various opposition groups. But in 2013, after the first decision to lift subsidies, there was a major crackdown in which almost 200 people were killed, mostly young children on the street protesting. Finally, 2018, the economic crisis comes to a boiling point. This is a picture of cars queuing for fuel. You had significant fuel shortages. You could not spend, you had to spend 2 to 3 days waiting in line just to fuel up your car. You had to wait for hours just to get bread. So basic commodities, there was many shortages, and it hit people hard. But the most important thing that really hit the urban elite, which kind of equalized between people, was that in order to arrest inflation, the government decided to limit cash withdrawals to about less than $20 a day. So you can never withdraw more than $20 of your own money out of the banking system. This created 2 things. First, it equalized everyone in that if you have money, you can't get access to it. If you don't have money, you're in the same boat. The second thing it did was it made people lose confidence in the banking sector. And the government can no longer control the price of the exchange rate, because all people did, as soon as they got access to cash, they went to the black market, exchanged it for dollars, and started saving at home. Finally, December 2018. On the 19th of December, well, let me just go back. There's a bit of controversy on when the uprising officially started. Some people say it started the week before the 19th in a small provincial town of Damazin in Blue Nile. Others say it happened in Darfur. But the real spark, figuratively and literally, was on the 19th, where the headquarters of the ruling party in a town in North Sudan called Atbara was torched. Now, it's very interesting because there's some research that shows that the autocrat will actually start targeting his own co-ethnics for taxing or subsidies because he believes that because his own co-ethnics will stick with him, they won't rise up against him. So Atbara was really kind of the heart of the regime's ethnic support base, one of the major areas. But even his own co-ethnics wouldn't stand with him. On the 19th, the story goes, young girls go to school in Atbara. They find that the price of their school meals tripled. They can no longer afford to buy school meals. They all go out on the streets, march to the market. People are shocked. How can these girls be protesting? Everyone was like, because life is so bad, we're going to go burn the NCP headquarters. Then, following 5 days, protests start spreading around the country. Finally, on the 25th, on Christmas Day, the protests reach Khartoum. This is the first and most important distinction between this uprising and the previous two uprisings. The first two uprisings in 1964 and 85 were elite, urban, Khartoum-driven protests. These protests started from the peripheries. All the cities and towns around the country started protesting until finally Khartoum came out on the 25th. I was in Khartoum on the 25th, and it was the largest protest in downtown Khartoum since Bashir came to power. And you could really feel this was different. January, as soon as the protests start moving, the street pushes the elites to start coalescing against Bashir. First, the civil society under the umbrella of the Sudan Professionals Association, which is a coalition of different professionals unions that tried to organize but were suppressed. Because Bashir knew his biggest threat was from elites and from the professionals, he prevented any organizing when it came to labor unions. But over the past 5-6 years, these unions started to organize and form shadow unions. And in fact, the protest in Khartoum on the 25th, which was organized by the Professionals Association, was advertised on Facebook as a protest to demand better wages before the protest in Atbara burned down the NCP. So they themselves didn't believe that they should be calling for the ouster of the regime. They just had basic demands, raising wages, better working conditions. But once the street mobilized, they were forced to actually raise the demands, and they shifted from wages towards regime change. And this is one of the second ways that this protest is different, is that it was actually the elites following the street rather than the other way around where the elites are driving the street. And then the SPA forms the Forces for Freedom and Change, which is a coalition of all the various political parties, all the rebel groups in the country, come under this 2-page document. They say, we want Bashir to go. We have these basic demands. And surprisingly, people start to follow what the Sudan Professionals Association does. In February, Bashir obviously retrenches, promises reforms. He sacks his entire cabinet. He fires his governors and appoints an all-military government in a show of force. But the protest continued. And this is a map put out by the Sudan Professionals Association. And these maps came out on Facebook every week, telling people which neighborhoods will protest, how they will organize, where they will come together. And amazingly, every week people showed up. And there was determination. And this coordination between civil society and the opposition continued to increase, and Bashir couldn't do anything about it. Finally, the regime recognized that they are not going to be able to sustain this much. Finally, on April 6th, which is the anniversary of the 1985 revolution, the opposition calls for a sit-in in front of the headquarters. And estimates vary, but it's around 200, possibly up to towards 800,000 people came to the heart of Khartoum, where the military headquarters are located. The sit-in continues, and finally, the straw on the camel's back was the fact that protesters would not leave the sit-in. Bashir is removed on the 11th of April, and a junta is installed. The junta represents Bashir's own Security Council, his National Security Council, which is made up of one major militia, formerly known as the Janjaweed, which was notorious for the crimes committed in Darfur, and the various entities within the military. Immediately, people do not accept this. They say, we want a civilian government. We don't trust the military to hand over power. From the 1985 revolution, they saw that when the military oversaw the uprising, the transition rather, they created a framework that set up the government to fail. So they called for a civilian government. And the sit-in continued for about 6 weeks. Negotiations between the Forces for Freedom and Change and the junta dragged on and on. And eventually the African Union intervened in the form of the Ethiopian president coming into Khartoum, forcing the two sides to come together and sit down. And at the same time, the African Union was pushing back against Gulf Arab states that were much more interested in ensuring that the junta stayed in power. Now, one of the militia that I spoke about, it's this gentleman here in gray. His name is Hemeti. Hemeti is this, his name is Hemeti, but Bashir called him Himayti, which means my protection in Arabic. And Bashir expected that Hemeti will actually stick with him, but unfortunately, Hemeti recognized, unfortunately for Bashir, Hemeti recognized that his fortunes are actually better to side with the revolution or the uprising than to stick with Bashir. Hemeti's forces are currently fighting in Yemen on behalf of the Saudis. They're also fighting alongside Khalifa Haftar in Libya. And they've been known to actually be involved all along the Sahel to serve all these regional interests. And he's being paid directly by the Emiratis and the Saudis. So he's almost become autonomous. It was the security apparatus that became so large that it became autonomous in and of itself, beyond the autocrat's own will. In June, negotiations stalled, and there was a severe crackdown on the 3rd of June, in which 120 people were killed. The sit-in was this magnificent space in which people came together and they created what I like to say was the first ever social democratic state in Sudan's history within this space. Because as you entered the sit-in, you had all the basic services that you can imagine. The doctors union set up hospitals throughout the sit-in where people got free health care. Pharmacists opened pharmacies where you could get free medicine. Free food was provided for everyone. There was free Wi-Fi. I mean, it was really amazing how people came together, and it was this space where people could really express this. It was almost like a cathartic moment for people to just heal after 30 years of oppression. Especially the role of women was very prominent in the sit-in because they were most vocal to talk about the oppression they experienced. The Islamist government it was nominally Islamist, but in the beginning they came with these Islamist policies that really targeted women in particular. Now, that was all basically destroyed on the 3rd of June, and in a matter of 3 weeks, the regime managed to destroy the sit-in, arrest several of the opposition figures, and at the same time, they shut the internet. So this tool that was used by the professionals to organize no longer existed. But the sit-in allowed people to create linkages amongst themselves and start to connect and create these networks that were able to survive the internet shutdown. And over a matter of 3 weeks, without any internet in the whole country, they managed to come back and force the military to cede. And on I think it was the 3rd of July, the Forces for Freedom and Change and the junta managed to sign a constitutional declaration. This constitutional declaration was very controversial because it didn't really address some of the real issues, which were the role of the military in the economy. The military managed to create this very vast military-industrial complex, again, with the weapons manufacturing, but also they invested heavily in agriculture, in private sector, other sectors of the economy. And you saw that they weren't willing to cede power because they were too worried they were going to lose this advantage. At the same time, they were worried because the junta itself, they were all implicated in the crimes of Bashir. They were involved in the genocide in Darfur. They created the oppression that kept Bashir in power. But I think because of international pressure, the Forces for Freedom and Change decided to accept this accommodation with the military, and they created what is called the Sovereignty Council. The Sovereignty Council is supposed to serve as the head of state, as well as a technocratic government. The Sovereignty Council is 6 civilians, 5 military, and the technocratic government and prime minister, which were sworn in last month, were all professionals that came from international organizations. The finance minister for 2 decades was at the World Bank. The prime minister was head of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa for about a decade and a half. The justice minister, interestingly, was completing his PhD at Georgetown Law, and he was whisked away before he could defend his dissertation. So he told his advisor, "I'm sorry, I have to go be the justice minister for my country." I'm sure he got away with that, right? Now, this technocratic government itself has many challenges because the real issues when it comes to the international involvement of Sudanese forces, when it comes to these sovereignty issues, the technocratic government isn't really empowered, and it's up to the Sovereignty Council. Of course, the military as an institution and the security apparatus is much more organized than the civilians. The civilians that were picked are just real random personalities that were picked. They were, of course, preeminent, respected people, but they weren't coming from one organization. They didn't represent one entity. So if there's a vote, it's much more likely that the Sovereignty Council's military contingent is going to vote together when compared to the civilians. Any questions? Yes?
Do you think that the diversity of people that are on the Sovereignty Council and civilians in the cabinet is actually a strength, given that they might be able to tap into greater networks, or do you think that the divisions might be, like you said, too much of a liability?
I think it's a double-edged sword. In many ways, the military's interests are much more aligned than the civilians. The civilians they represent the geographic diversity of Sudan and, to a certain extent, the ethnic diversity, but they don't speak with one voice necessarily. We have, for example, a retired professor, we have a journalist, we have an activist. So it's a disparate group of people, really, if that makes any sense. Okay? All right. Oh, sorry, yeah?
Yeah, I was wondering what the popular response was to these technocratic appointments, the people who seemed not directly involved with the protests.
Sure. So it was a very difficult, challenging process for the prime minister to appoint a cabinet. The Forces for Freedom and Change nominated 3 individuals for each position. Then there was this public vetting process that was quite gruesome, I'd say. It dug out all the dirt for people that were nominated, and one by one people started apologizing and dropping out because of something they did 20 or 30 years ago. But at the same time, I think the Prime Minister, Abdullah Hamdok, who's this UN economist, did a good job by pushing back against the various forces within the opposition. At the same time, he, I think, astutely did not want to confront the military directly. So he tried to appoint people that he knew would fly under the radar, not necessarily be confrontational, and to a certain extent, I think he did a good job. All right, so as far as prospects, I think there are 4 major challenges. The first challenge is going to be the economy. The number one thing that drove people to go out on the streets is the economy. Living conditions, wages, the exchange rate, trade imbalance, all these things are structural problems that no change in government is going to resolve unless you address the root causes of these challenges, which is the fact that Sudan has not had a productive industry or economy for the past 20 years, save for the oil. How are you going to restructure the economy? Now, the bigger challenge is going to be the reforms that are necessary are the same reforms that force people out on the streets. The idea behind having a transitional government is that this government will be able to, I guess, take the bitter pill that no elected government can take. It's going to need to institute the tough economic policies that are going to redirect Sudan's trajectory towards a productive industry. But this means more lifting of subsidies. This means harsher economic policies that are going to affect people. The finance minister talked about completely getting off subsidies and moving towards a cash transfer program to the poor. That is going to be quite destabilizing for the economy initially. How is that going to be instituted now? The country has a very poor there's no infrastructure. Not many people have access to banks. How are you going to institute this cash transfer program? That's going to be very tough. And of course, the cabinet is, the cream of the crop of Sudanese World Bank types that are going to institute these structural adjustment reforms that will be very difficult to sell for the general public. I'm not so sure they're going to succeed, to be honest, because there's no easy fix. The second challenge is going to be the need to come to peace agreements and address the historical injustices of the periphery, of the center to the periphery. Sudan's history has been marred by this identity crisis. If you look at Sudan on a map of Africa, it's really the frontier where the Arab Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa meet. It's always had challenges about, is Sudan an Arab country? Is Sudan an African country? Is Sudan able to create its own identity? It's failed for 60 years. But now, how do you actually allow the people in the periphery to see themselves within the state? How are these people that have been marginalized going to be equitably represented in power and through the economic distribution of resources? Peace agreements have been signed by Bashir over decades, but they were meant to basically divide political armed resistance. This new government, in order to appease the various elements of these armed groups, is going to need to, first of all, accommodate them somehow inside the centers of power in Khartoum, but also restructure the Sudanese state from this weak post-colonial extractive design of taking from the periphery to the center and actually making the center serve the periphery. Any state should have a very small, center and a federal system where every entity gets actual representation. Number 3 is also the economy. No. So let me talk about the fourth one, which is jostling between political elites. Here, what I mean is that the military, the elites in Khartoum, how are these people going to actually last through the transition? The transition itself is a 3-year period in which the first 18 months, the military gets to take over, but then the second half, the civilians are supposed to take over. I think there's some benefits to this design. And the most important one is that both the military and the civilian opposition have ownership of this transition. So once the economy gets bad and the tough decisions get made, the military can't just come in and coup out the civilians. They can't say, oh, we're going to fix this, because they're part of this transitional period. So they own it as much as the civilians do. And making sure that the old cabal of Sudanese opposition parties don't really go back to their ways of wrangling between themselves over seats. The real challenge now for them is sorry about that. Oh. Oh. You know what it is? It's my email. That's it, yeah. My email calls me sometimes. Okay. There's going to be a legislative council made up of 300 members. This legislative council is supposed to, serve as a transitional council. But how are these individuals going to be appointed? People are going to compete over seats. Which opposition party is the largest? Which one deserves the most seats? And the real challenge, I think, is going to be how do you actually transition the political culture in Sudan from 30 years of autocracy towards a culture of democracy? In particular here, I want to highlight the role of women. Women played a very central role in the uprising. In particular, during the first 3 months before Bashir was toppled. Those were the toughest 3 months because people didn't have any idea if it's going to succeed. But at every protest, every procession throughout the country, it was women in the forefront. And when I was in Khartoum after Bashir was toppled, a friend of mine told me this very interesting analogy, and he said that, traditionally Sudanese women are seen, obviously, like in many societies, as the givers of life, the sustainers of life, and they saw that the society was dying. They felt like there's no more opportunities for people. People are going hungry, so they felt like it's their responsibility to step up. Obviously, that's one reading, but I think it really shows that women played a really central role, but now they've been completely sidelined. During the transition, only one woman represented the opposition forces during the negotiations with the military. Only 2 women are part of the 11-member Sovereignty Council. Of 20 cabinet seats, there are only 4 women. How do you transition the society from this, basically misogynistic approach to governing towards a more democratic one that, understands and incorporates the various elements of society? With that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to open it up for questions if people have any. All right.
I have 2 real quick ones. Does Sudan have friends that can be helpful without exploiting it? Number 1. And number 2, it seems like all the basic ingredients are there for outside mischief makers to come in, people of the ilk of Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda or whomever. But you haven't mentioned that last aspect at all. Has that been a problem? So does Sudan have friends, and are the terrorist groups alive and well in Sudan?
So thankfully, up until now, Sudan has almost been immune to the presence of, or the activities of terrorist groups, rather. Simply because the regime itself, the previous regime, played such a central role in actually creating relationships with these terrorist groups. I mean, it's no surprise that Sudan has been on the state sponsors of terrorism list because the government was actually sponsoring terrorism. The new government is very concerned about that. We saw 2 weeks ago they closed the border between Sudan and Libya and Sudan and Central Africa because they were concerned with the flow of some groups in and out of the country. At the same time, the real challenge is going to be how do you actually ensure that the regional interests are aligned to help Sudan's flourishing democracy continue. There is a democracy deficit in this part of the world, and if every country around Sudan is not a democracy, they're all autocracies, we're going to see that they're going to push for the military to come back, probably try to stall this democratization process. That's going to be a real challenge. Yeah.
So thank you for this. This was pretty enlightening. And just following up on what you said right now with Sudan needing to be surrounded by more democratic atmospheres, environments, I guess, what do you think is the role, or could it be the possible role of the African Union?
Yeah, I think the African Union really deserves to be lauded in that it played a very central role in pressuring the military and the opposition to talk and to come to an agreement. The African Union has a doctrine whereby it expels any state that has an extrajudicial transfer of power, namely a coup. We saw it kick out countries that have coups, and that's what it did to Sudan. As soon as the coup happened, they said, we won't let you, we'll stall your membership until you install a government. That was very important and a very direct message to the military to tell them, look, we're very serious about civilian rule in Sudan. Now, of course, the African Union itself is, in many ways, a very weak institution. Some call it a club for dictators because there are a lot of autocrats in sub-Saharan Africa. But surprisingly, it's played a much more positive role than, for example, the Gulf states. Moving forward, though, the real challenge is how much, once the current framework for power gets normalized, if there's a slow degradation in the process, or if there's a slow takeover by the military, is the African Union going to keep the transition in check? Is it going to keep monitoring this agreement? I think there's really no political appetite to destabilize Sudan again, and they're much more interested in making sure that the transition goes as smoothly as possible. Yeah. Wow. Okay, great. We can go over here.
Hello. Thanks for coming from Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
This point is, I was essentially wondering, how susceptible is the Transition Council to foreign spoilers, especially the Gulf countries' relations with Saleh Ghosh or Hamati?
Yeah, so Salah Ghosh, I didn't mention him, but he was Bashir's security chief. And since the coup, he's been on this rebranding mission to say that he's really the guy who made the revolution happen, when in reality, he did everything to keep Bashir in power. Salah Ghosh has a lot of connections with the Emiratis, but so does Hamati. Now, Hamati, the head of this militia, has been personally and directly funded by the Emiratis. When the coup happened, he said, I'm going to generously put $1 billion, billion with a B, in the central bank of Sudan to stabilize the currency. That's a problem. If one individual, a militia leader, who has access to international support, but he also has access to literally a mountain of gold in western Sudan, this Jabal Amir, which is this really rich deposit of gold, he's able to finance his own way. He doesn't need to subordinate himself to the finance minister. If the finance minister is going to, say, we need you to put all your money in the central bank, how is that going to happen? And I've heard through some people is the concern for the U.S. about the state sponsors of terrorism list is that all this financing is happening outside the control of the state. But in reality, the only thing the United States can do now is lift Sudan's name off the state sponsors of terrorism list. Because if it doesn't do that, it's going to lead to the failure of the transition and much more likely a retrenchment of the military and possibly a comeback of a new autocracy. Now, I'm trying to be hopeful as much as I can be, but all political science research tells us that Sudan should not transition to democracy. Maybe it will. I don't know. But the international actors have not been supportive, including the U.S., because the U.S. is stalling on this removal of state sponsors of terrorism list. Obviously, that's not something that can be done overnight, but it needs to happen as soon as possible. Of course, the Emiratis and the Gulf states are interested in making sure that the military is entrenched, but I think it's going to be very difficult for them to convince the street, because now the street, like I said, is almost autonomous from the political opposition. It has its own will now. It's driving things before the political elites. Yeah, Professor.
You sort of answered my question, but there seems to be a kind of a pro-U.S. tilt within Sudan, and or leaning from it. But even though we had sanctions on them for 20 plus years, but that was lifted 2 years ago. The state sponsored of terrorism needs to be another change, but I know that the Chinese have been investing in Sudan, not necessarily to the as I said, Sudanese are not necessarily really want that. Seems to be like they want U.S. to come forward. And that was really my question. I think you sort of answered it. Was, you know, what is the U.S. really doing anything to move this along? They've taken one step, but do you know, is there any other?
You know, I'd characterize the U.S.'s engagement with Sudan over the past 20 years as this constant fear of losing leverage. The U.S. has always talked about we need to maintain leverage on Sudan. So the sanctions have been used as leverage. Now the sanctions have largely been removed. But now there's a state sponsors of terrorism list, which is now being used as a new leverage card. And if it doesn't get removed, I don't think the U.S. will actually help its own interests in the region. Sudan as a country, demographically, is actually a microcosm of the entire region, from ethnic groups that spill over into Ethiopia and Eritrea, and ethnic groups that are actually migratory. They go all the way throughout the Sahel, from Chad to Niger to Mali. And you know that there are all these organizations that are operating there against these interests. And if Sudan were to fail or descend into state failure, that entire region is going to be affected very deleteriously, I think. And there is no option but to lift the state sponsors of terrorism list. I don't know why it hasn't happened. Obviously, it's only been a few months. But the U.S. has been saying we want to see what the transition looks like. Now the transition's in place, it needs to be lifted.
It's probably too soon for U.S. private sector investment.
At this stage, I think, yeah, the private sector is probably more cautious. But you already see companies coming in. After the sanctions were listed, people were very excited about Pizza Hut coming into the country. But obviously, there are other multinationals that are moving in. But I think most of the global banking industry, which is really important when it comes to investment, has shied away. The Obama administration actually fined a French bank, I think it's called BNP Paribas, $8 billion for acting as a go-between for Sudanese transactions. That really put a shock to the banking system, and now any sort of transaction that has Sudan in it is flagged. Unfortunately for South Sudan, all their transactions get flagged as well because Sudan is in their name, but they're not under the sanctions. So, too bad for them. Yeah. Yeah, the most recent census took place in 2008, before the referendum for Southern independence. But that was highly politicized and questionable. According to those figures, the largest city is obviously Khartoum, with about 8 million people. But the second largest city is Nyala, which is in Darfur. So the demographic center is certainly towards the west. not the North, where power and economic interests have been monopolized. Now, when it comes to the trajectory, obviously, like many other countries, it's highly urbanizing. And unfortunately, because of the wars, you have these huge internally displaced people's camps that have been created along some of these big cities that have become cities in and of themselves. Sudan has, I think, over almost 2 million displaced people. So that's a real challenge. But as far as the ethnic makeup, obviously, it's still very segregated. You have entire neighborhoods in Khartoum that represent certain ethnic communities. But the real challenge is going to be, how do you actually restructure the state to serve people where they are, to help them access the state and its services, but at the same time make sure that they're also represented in the center of power. It's a real challenge. Yeah.
Yes. So we have these security services and military that were involved in many of the atrocities that Bashir was accused of. So now that some of them are, let's say, still in the political elite, what will be the future for these people, and especially in terms of this agreement and some kind of, have there been any discussion about amnesty, or now that the ICC may come after that, and how could that affect the peace agreement in the future?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because it's really one of the bigger challenges when it comes to the political jostling. Here, there was a big debate during the transition and the talks that happened in May, June, July about immunity for members of the Sovereignty Council. It was agreed that there'll be procedural immunity in that they won't be prosecuted while they're in office, which obviously incentivizes them never to leave office. That's why Bashir stuck around for so long. He was worried about the ICC. But at the same time, I think that is going to lead to a clash eventually, because many of the individuals that obviously committed the crimes, even during the uprising, are the same people in the Sovereignty Council. How do you accommodate that? At the same time, Hamdouk, the prime minister, is under a lot of pressure to actually move ahead on prosecutions. The Transitional Military Council, the junta, before it became a part of the Sovereignty Council, tried to have this very rushed investigation, and then they implicated some junior officers, of course, but they're not going to accept any sort of genuine oversight. How does that look when it comes to victims and their rights and the pressure from the street? I'm not sure they'll be able to accommodate that. Yeah.
I'm really interested in like ruling system that mentioned like civilized urban, like the government, and then also like the civilians. Like what type of aspects like process went into deciding that system would be beneficial for their society?
Sure. So the system officially is a parliamentary system. The idea here is that Sudan's previous democracies were parliamentary system. They weren't presidential systems. The idea behind a parliamentary system is that you have a very symbolic, weak head of state with a very strong executive parliamentary council with a prime minister. The issue is the civilians believe that the Sovereignty Council is just symbolic, and they're sitting up there and representing the state in ceremonies, while the military is sitting in the Sovereignty Council thinking, oh, these civilians are actually doing what we're telling them to do. So I think people actually are seeing what they want to see in the system. Unfortunately, the real challenge is going to be this transitional legislative council. What is the role of the Legislative Council? Is it supposed to actually pass all the legislation that or approve the legislation that the cabinet puts forward? Or is it the Sovereignty Council that's going to approve these legislations? That's actually not very clear in the, I think it's clear in the constitutional document, but I don't think people are reading it in the same way. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Stepping back a bit, you mentioned that women were invaluable in getting the uprising started, but were underrepresented when it came to the transition council. What was the missing link there that needed so that they were no longer represented when things actually started rolling?
Sure. So the real problem is that all the institutions, namely the political parties that represented the Forces for Freedom and Change, these people that were negotiating with the military, were all men. Their party leadership are all men. The vast majority of party members and organizers are men, and women aren't given the opportunity to actually play a meaningful role. There are certain parties that have empowered some women that were really used as tokens, unfortunately, in the transition. They really weren't given a real say, not because they weren't there, because they weren't interested. It's because they were actually not given the opportunity to play a role in the formal institutions. So because they weren't given a role in these formal institutions, they then went and took over the mobilization on the street. But then when the mobilization led to a transition, it went back to those formal institutions that didn't have the representation that was necessary. At this stage, I think Hamdok, the Prime Minister, recognizes this. In fact, the nominees for the foreign minister that were given to him by the opposition forces were all men. He then said, I'm not going to take any of these. And for the prime ministership, the foreign minister, he appointed a female. And it was the first time in Sudan's history, which is seen as this trademark, this landmark event. But again, is that really symbolic? I think so in many ways. But also I think that it's really going to need to change. This is not sustainable, of course, because now women represent over 60% of graduates from universities in Sudan. They're much more highly educated in Sudan. And they are going to represent the real forces that could help Sudan come out of this 30-year period of autocracy.
So I was asked to make sure that we wrap up at 5:30.
Okay.
So if we can thank Ahmed, and I'm sure he can stick around for any one-on-one questions for those interested.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sorry to cut you off. I saw your hand up.
Future associated potential rifts. I'm thinking of what happened in Egypt with the constitutional crisis.
Yeah, that's a good question. Jackie, hey, how's it going? Thanks for coming all the way out here.
Yeah.
Nice to
Get your question in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
DC in Georgetown. So
I'll see you later.
Yeah, I think you were just there, actually. Tell me about that.
I school public policy and then the security studies. So the security studies program.
No, go for it.
It's kind of your opinion. I was supposed to go to Sudan for the first time last year.
Wow.
My church
And I have a class like Ambassador Jet, and if you're familiar with them, all his classes are all like a lot of historical books that are reading. A lot like more about the structure of how diplomacy was evolved, and less about the overall dynamics.
Yeah, that's true. So you're glad you were
Oh, most definitely. I'm really enjoying it. I like the different approach also to get both of them. Well, it was great seeing you. I'll see you around.
Sure. Yeah.
I was thrilled to be able to visit.
Yeah. So safety-wise, one of the benefits of having a strong police state is that it provides safety in the regions it controls. Safety, yes, Khartoum is very safe. Even the north is very safe.